Yes, they're all very much related. And as you might guess, this will be a somewhat esoteric technical discussion on decisions that are made before a new car is released to the public. New EPA drive mode range testing policy now makes full-time all-wheel drive and high-power four-wheel regen compatible with marketing priorities. Audi developed their Quattro all-wheel drive drivetrain in the 1980s and then took it racing. It so completely dominated the competition that by 1989, all-wheel drive was banned. Full-time all-wheel drive is even more practical and effective today for performance electric road cars, with separate motors front and rear, individually controlled by sophisticated software. Dual-motor all-wheel drive EVs are hugely popular because of their high power and effortless 0 to 60 times. For most drivers new to EVs, that crazy acceleration is a party trick, and the quiet, responsive drivetrain, low maintenance, and ability to charge at home are what matters most. That and having good range. Manufacturers have figured out how to give both power and efficiency by crafting their default drive modes to maximize the EPA-tested range. As with most everything, there are compromises. I recently made a video suggesting there should be 2 Rivian R3X off-road variants and 2 R3 on-road variants. In particular, I focused on a dual-motor on-road performance R3. This video explores drive modes for that car that would enhance the enthusiast driving experience versus neutering it. With perhaps a bit of naivety, I assumed dual-motor all-wheel drive EVs operated with full-time all-wheel drive. That was important to me because I'm an enthusiast one-pedal driver, and strong four-wheel regen braking is only possible if you have full-time all-wheel drive. And since I'm also a physics geek, I view a car's handling in terms of force and acceleration vectors, and know all-wheel drive is simply faster and provides more control through curves than either rear-wheel drive or front-wheel drive. So, much to my dismay, I discovered my 5-year-old dual-motor, all-wheel drive Model Y is primarily a rear-wheel drive car, which explained why the rear tire tread wore out so quickly, while the front tread was fine. Cost me $1,000 for a new set of Hankook Evos. Then I found a YouTube video of an instrumented test comparing the Model Y's default all-wheel drive mode to its hidden, genuine, full-time all-wheel drive mode, which was activated with Tesla's off-road assist setting in the dynamics menu, which says adjust traction control to optimize performance off-road. A suitably vague and misleading description, especially for an on-road car. The YouTuber's test logic system showed power in and power out from each motor in real time. He found that the car driven in full-time all-wheel drive used just 4% more energy than the mostly rear-wheel drive default mode. I've provided a link to the video in the description below. The 4% energy penalty is trivial to me. I charge with free solar power at home and rarely drive more than 50 miles a day, so I now happily activate the off-road assist mode in the dynamics menu every time I get in the car to enable full-time all-wheel drive. The improved driving experience is palpable. It just rocks. But to car manufacturers, that 4% efficiency deficit could result in a 12-mile EPA range penalty, more or less. I imagine that could be significant enough to persuade the car maker to modify the default drive mode to increase the EPA range. Just how would they do that exactly? apparently something they would prefer not to explain. Here's how Lucid explains their drive modes, in effusive literary prose that doesn't tell you anything about what the car's drivetrain is actually doing. Lucid's default mode is smooth, an eco mode, to maximize the EPA range rating. Tesla's default driving mode is similar to Rivian's default all-purpose mode in their dual-motor vehicles. When the driver is not calling for robust acceleration, the software disconnects a motor to activate either rear-wheel drive, Tesla, or front-wheel drive, Rivian, to maximize range. The driver isn't choosing to engage an eco or conserve mode. That action is imposed by Big Brother. In 1971, the EPA started testing for fuel efficiency in cars, miles per gallon. In 1975, the CAFE standards were enacted, corporate average fuel economy, intending to double the efficiency of cars in 10 years. In 2010, the EPA started testing electric car efficiency using the bizarre unit of miles per gallon of gasoline energy equivalent. That was a flop. The commonly accepted measure of efficiency for EVs is now miles per kilowatt hour, which should be adopted by the EPA. After 15 years, EPA range ratings have outlived their usefulness and should be dropped. They do nothing to promote efficiency. Car makers can and do increase range simply by installing bigger batteries. For example, the electric Hummer has an impressive range rating of 381 miles, but a miserable 1.8 miles per kilowatt hour efficiency. While the most efficient EVs today are getting around 5 miles per kilowatt hour. Early EVs couldn't go 80 miles without a charge, less if it was cold or raining. Public chargers were scarce or non-existent. Range anxiety was born and persisted, even though later EVs could go hundreds of miles on a charge. Journalists have continued to dwell on range anxiety, even though it's no longer a thing for people who actually own an EV. But for people looking for their first EV, range has unfortunately become a litmus test for the relative worth of an EV. Some people may need or want a long-range EV, but that doesn't mean all EVs need to have long range. If you absolutely must have long range, there are very efficient EVs like the Lucid Air Pure with a 420-mile EPA range, or the Model 3 that will go 370 highway miles on a charge. To its credit, Rivian is not chasing maximum range in its vehicles. It offers several batteries in its R1 vehicles, with ranges from useful mid-200s to over 400 miles for those who demand big. The planned range for the Rivian R2 is less than 300 miles for the small battery and over 300 with the larger battery option. Both reasonable choices, even if the smaller battery makes more sense for most people. But Rivian still restricts its dual-motor driving modes to maximize the EPA range by always defaulting to all-purpose mode at startup. And that mode shifts to front-wheel drive most of the time. In Rivian's base dual-motor vehicles, there's no way to activate full-time all-wheel drive. In the performance dual-motor trim, a sport mode will activate full-time all-wheel drive, but this has to be selected every time you get in. Doesn't have to be that way. Most EVs have a single default drive mode, invariably the most efficient mode. The EPA will test using that mode, Rivian's all-purpose mode, for example. If the driver switches to another drive mode, Sport for example, that mode will revert to the default all-purpose mode next time the car is turned on. The EPA now also recognizes that EVs may have multiple default drive modes that persist once they have been selected. The EPA calls these latching modes. This new policy applies to 2024 and later model year cars. For example, a Rivian dual-motor Performance R3 should for sure have a default or latching full-time all-wheel drive mode, Sport. Because that car will also be driven in more pedestrian ways, for example, highway road trips and casual commuting, it should also have a default all-purpose mode that switches to front-wheel drive for normal driving. If a car has multiple latching modes, the manufacturer must test for range for each of those drive modes. I've added a link to the EPA's policy letter on this in the description below. Happily, the EPA gives the manufacturer the option of using for the car's EPA range either 1. The average of the best and worst case results, or 2. The worst result. I suspect all would pick the average of the two ranges. That average range, the official EPA range, would be lower than the tested range for the more efficient all-purpose mode, but higher than the range for the sport mode. The EPA is throwing a bone to the car maker who wants to give their customers the convenience of two different latching drive modes. Rivian should therefore adopt both all-purpose and sport latching modes for the dual-motor Performance R3 and explain to prospective customers exactly how each mode works. That should include the expected efficiency under different conditions, highway, city, winter, etc., for each of those modes. So, typical EV reviews look at infotainment systems, mood lighting, backseat room, and most of all, 0 to 60 times. But it would be hard to argue that acceleration is more important than slowing. And yet, how many reviewers measure 60 to 0 slowing times using one-pedal regen? Having full-time all-wheel drive as a latching mode enables more effective four-wheel regen braking and begs for a high-power regen option, which in turn would recuperate more energy. The primary frustration with my Model Y is only having 85 kilowatts maximum regen power available for one-pedal driving. I now know this limitation stems primarily from the car defaulting most of the time to rear-wheel drive. The two rear wheels by themselves cannot rapidly slow the car. If sudden braking is required or when slowing down a hill, the friction brakes must be used, requiring the foot to shuffle over to that other pedal. Two pedals required to control speed. How old-fashioned. And of course, friction braking decreases efficiency. In the past, I thought a high regen power option could be 120 kilowatts. But because people have different one-pedal preferences, I now think maximum regen power should be chosen by the individual driver. After selecting the high regen option, the driver would be prompted to select the specific maximum regen power, say between 100 and 200 kilowatts. You'll never know which is best until you try them. If the rear wheels can easily handle 85 kilowatts of regen power, then the front wheels, that ordinarily do the most braking, could handle at least another 85 kilowatts of regen. Together, 170 kilowatts. If you add a front bias to braking power, that takes you close to 200 kilowatts. Again, to ensure this increased maximum regen power would be safe and effective, the car would have to be set to operate in full-time all-wheel drive before the high regen option appears, when regen braking would be applied through all four wheels. Since I've never driven one pedal with very high regen power, I can only imagine how it would feel, but I'm confident I could get used to it and would like it a lot. Just takes practice. Remember, the driver sets the maximum value, so decides what level is best for them. They could start lower and increase over time. And as always, the driver controls the level of regen at any moment by modulating the pedal. Just as you would only press the pedal to the floor if you wanted maximum acceleration, you would only lift completely off the pedal if you wanted maximum deceleration or had come to a stop. Foot stays on the pedal when driving. It's worth noting that EVs with over 600 to more than 1,000 horsepower, made by Tesla, Rivian, Lucid, and others, can be bought and driven by people with no special training. All that power controlled with the one pedal. So why should anyone worry about a fraction of that power being controlled as regen by the same pedal? Batteries are not able to absorb much regen, or charging power, which is what regen is, when they are close to fully charged, are very cold, or very hot. Because regen does not work well in those cases, Tesla's dynamic screen shows car manufacturers have started to blend in friction braking in those instances to give the same braking feel as regen, with just the one pedal use. But when the battery is not at a high state of charge and not very cold or hot, it can absorb very high rates of charge. For example, the Porsche Taycan can absorb as much as 400 kilowatts of regen power using the brake pedal, since tradition-bound Porsche has disavowed one-pedal driving. A full-time all-wheel drive, road-focused R3 would give enthusiast drivers enhanced performance and handling, and with the option of increased maximum regen power, a far better one-pedal driving experience. EPA's new reasonable range measurement policy for cars with multiple latching modes means car manufacturers can go this route without incurring a significant marketing penalty. But you know, if someone just wants the best range, steer them toward the single motor R3. More choices, another happy customer.